Imagine a young king consumed by a disease that slowly deprived him of movement, yet who still led troops with sword in hand, mounted on his horse, facing powerful enemies like Saladin. This is Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the Leper King, a figure who defies the imaginable. In this video, we will delve into a little explored but deeply symbolic aspect of Baldwin's life. How he, even afflicted by leprosy, was able to command armies on the battlefield, and the fundamental role of his horse in this physical and spiritual challenge. It is not merely about military strategies, but the daily struggle against pain, limitation, and prejudice. You will discover how Baldwin adapted his mount, how he inspired his soldiers even with a weakened body, and the visual and psychological impact his presence caused on both sides of the war. Stay until the end to understand how, on horseback and with hands covered by silk gloves, this teenage king defied both the medicine of his time and the great Muslim armies. Baldwin did not merely ride, he carried a throne on the saddle. In the 12th century, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was a fragile Crusader conquest wedged among Islamic powers. Founded after the First Crusade, the kingdom was sustained by Frankish nobles, military orders, and armed pilgrims. Its territory was constantly threatened by Muslim forces unified under leaders like Nur ad-Din and later Saladin. When Baldwin ascended the throne, still a teenager, the scenario was one of extreme tension, frequent battles, a shortage of troops, and internal disputes among nobles. In this hostile context, a king with leprosy was not just an anomaly, it was a challenge to the political and military logic of the time. Baldwin was diagnosed with leprosy in his youth, possibly at 9 years of age, according to William of Tyre, his tutor and chronicler. The disease, progressive and incurable at the time, should have kept him from any public life. However, against all odds, he not only inherited the throne, but also defended it with impressive courage, including in direct battles against the great Saladin. Riding a horse in the Middle Ages was already, in itself, a task that required physical readiness and skill. Riding in full armor, leading heavily armed knights under the scorching sun of Palestine, was something reserved for warriors in peak condition. And yet, Baldwin not only rode, he commanded. As leprosy progressed, Baldwin lost sensation in his hands and feet. His muscles atrophied, and open wounds required constant care. To keep fighting, ingenious adaptations were necessary. Sources suggest that Baldwin used modified reins, tied to the wrist or wrapped in cloth, so that he could guide his horse even without full strength in his fingers. His horse, in turn, was no ordinary war animal. It was trained to obey subtle touches, react precisely, and protect the king amid the chaos. During the famed Battle of Montgisard in 1177, Baldwin, then about 16 years old, rode at the front of his soldiers. According to accounts, he had to be literally tied to the saddle to stay upright during the charge. Not from weakness of spirit, but because his body was already beginning to fail. Leprosy was corroding his joints, causing fevers, and reducing his mobility. And even so, his presence changed the course of the battle. To see that young leprous king at the head of the Christian army, mounted in glory, was a moral blow to Saladin and a cry of hope for his soldiers. The impact was symbolic and spiritual. A king considered impure according to Jewish and Islamic tradition, but who, for the Christians, took on an almost messianic role, reminiscent of martyrs who suffered in the body but triumphed in faith. His knights said that even when Baldwin could barely hold a sword, he remained on the battlefield so that his presence would inspire courage. One of his squires, according to later accounts, said that the king bled inside but rode as if made of iron. The horse, in this sense, was more than a mount. It was an extension of the king's will, his living armor, his firm leg amid the instability of the world. Over time, as the disease forced him to use gloves to hide the visible effects of leprosy, Baldwin began to fight with his face covered, his body wrapped in special cloths. and often aided by loyal vassals who supported him in the saddle during the most difficult moments. The relationship between the king and his mount became almost symbiotic. The horse bore the weight of a sick king, yes, but also the weight of an entire kingdom. Baldwin, in his frailty, became a symbol of resistance, and as long as he could stay mounted, the kingdom of Jerusalem stood. Baldwin's persistence in joining battles even in advanced stages of leprosy was not merely a display of personal bravery, it was a political and spiritual necessity. The king knew that his presence on the battlefield had unmatched value. It united quarreling barons, upheld the morale of the Crusaders, and sent a powerful signal to the Muslim world. Jerusalem still resisted. As the years passed, leprosy progressed visibly. Baldwin began to rely increasingly on auxiliary knights to stay firm in the saddle. In later campaigns, such as the defense of Damascus and the skirmishes in the Jordan Valley, he no longer led charges directly, but remained present at the rear of the field, mounted, surrounded by his personal guard, observing, instructing, and representing the continuity of royal authority. His horse became an essential part of that image. Such animals, specially trained to bear the weight of a sick royal rider and remain calm amid the turmoil of battles, were invaluable. Indirect sources suggest that Baldwin had a sturdy mount, perhaps a destrier or a war palfrey, accustomed to the king's routine and sensitive to minimal signals given by reins, light spur, or vocal command. The use of silk gloves, besides hiding the visible lesions on his hands, also prevented infections and served as a barrier against dust and sun. But the gloves also carried symbolism. They covered the impurity and allowed Baldwin to still be touched in ceremonies or even to hold the cross before battles without causing scandal. Accounts describe him wrapped in fine fabrics, his face partially veiled, mounted with dignity and discipline. Even the enemies saw him as someone exceptional. Saladin, in fact, showed respect for Baldwin on more than one occasion. After the failed campaign of 1183, Saladin is said to have referred to the Leper king as a worthy adversary who yields neither to disease nor to fear. This recognition highlights the impact Baldwin had, even psychologically, by showing that not even a ruined body was enough to stop him. Internally, his figure also served as a political instrument. The Frankish nobles often clashed out of ambition, but in Baldwin's presence they knew they argued under the eyes of a king who suffered in silence and fought for all. His remaining mounted during public audiences or while leading troops helped maintain that fragile unity. It was as if, by staying on horseback, Baldwin held up the entire fragile structure of the kingdom. When he finally ceased to participate in military campaigns around 1184, it became necessary to appoint regents, which sparked disputes and eventually weakened the kingdom. Many soldiers and chroniclers pointed out that the absence of the royal figure in the field, and not merely his death, which would come shortly after, was the harbinger of Jerusalem's collapse, culminating in the defeat at Hattin. But while he rode, Baldwin was more than a king. He was a living symbol. His horse was not merely a means of transport, but part of the sacred ritual of a sovereign who defied bodily pain in the name of something greater: the protection of a holy city, the faith of pilgrims, the honor of the Crusaders. The image of Baldwin mounted on his horse, facing enemies with a body consumed by leprosy, is one of the most moving in the entire history of the Crusades. Not because of dramatization, but because there stood a king who surpassed his own physical limits in the name of his people, his faith, and his crown. At a time when leprosy was synonymous with exclusion and impurity, Baldwin turned it into a throne of resistance. His horse, always present, became a symbol of the union between fragility and strength. It was the silent support of a king who could no longer walk, but who still led. In every battle, the mere sight of the young leper on horseback reminded everyone that courage does not depend on an intact body, but on an unbreakable spirit. Baldwin's story teaches us that heroism is not the absence of suffering. It is facing it head-on with dignity. If you were moved by this story, like the video, share it with those who love medieval history, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, every king has his chronicle, and Baldwin, the Leper King, deserves to be remembered as a true knight of faith.